welcome back to Introduction to the Bible. My name's Duncan Corby and I'm taking over from Katrina, who has just been teaching you Old Testament. So we're moving into the New Testament now. So let me give you a little bit of an overview of what is going to be happening over our next few lectures together. The first thing that you probably need to realise as we get started with this is, whilst you might be expecting that what we're going to do is introduce you to the individual books of the New Testament, which is what we're going to do, but because this is degree level studies, what we are going to be doing is introducing you to the study of the New Testament as an academic discipline. So what that is going to mean is that a large part of our conversations are going to be dealing with the issues that scholars in the New Testament have been grappling with probably over the last couple of 100 years, introducing you to the history of scholarship about different aspects of the New Testament. Some of the other things that we're going to cover will be things like the history behind individual books, the history of their composition, the history of their interpretation. We'll also be discussing questions in relation to genre and how we go about reading the different genres of New Testament literature. We'll also be examining some of the critical issues that have been raised as scholars have looked at the books of the New Testament. And from time to time, you're going to find some of the topics that get raised to be rather interesting. And what that will result in, I think, is an enlarging of your understanding of what the New Testament is, both as an historical document, but also as the way that we think about it as Scripture. I think many of you are probably coming to the study of this topic with a very high view of the New Testament as the Word of God. The New Testament is Scripture, and many of you are probably very deeply committed to ideas such as inerrancy and authority and inspiration. And I'm certainly into all of those ideas, and we are going to be exploring topics that will touch on those. But I think one of the things you need to prepare yourself for is the way that we're going about doing this subject is going to cause you to think more deeply about what do you think the New Testament is as Scripture. So as long as you're good for that, we're going to have ourselves a fantastic time together. So let's get started, shall we? The first cab off the rank as we come to doing the New Testament is we're going to have a look at the intertestamental period. We're going to spend a couple of classes doing that one because in order to really understand the New Testament, you need to have wrapped your mind around the history, the politics, the religion, the culture, the changes in society that took place between the Old Testament and the New Testament. As I heard one person describe it, if you've read the Old Testament and you see how it ends, you realise that the action takes place in Israel, it's focused around the Jews, they speak Hebrew, and everything is looked at in that setting. But then when you get into the New Testament, you discover that the action spreads far and wide beyond the land of Israel. The action includes now not just Jews, but also Gentiles to a large degree. And the language that we're speaking now is no longer Hebrew, but it's Greek. How did those changes take place? The answer to those kind of questions is summed up in what happens in the 450 to 500 years of history between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New. So the first thing we want to do is to bridge that period of time. Because one of the things that you need to realise is that when Jesus arrives on the scene, when he is born to Mary and to Joseph, he isn't born into a vacuum. He's born into a context where there is a huge amount going on politically, religiously, culturally, and there are a large number of very powerful forces working together and working against each other, and Jesus is born right into the depths of that environment. And a large part of being able to understand what Jesus is saying and what he's trying to achieve is achieved by understanding what has been going on in the background and what it is that God is trying to achieve by sending his Son to be Messiah into that context at that time. So that's what we're going to try and do over the next couple of lectures, is paint the picture for you of what is going on between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So let's dive in, shall we, and remind ourselves of where the Old Testament finished off. It finished, if you remember, by Israel being taken off into captivity. And this happened under the hands of the Babylonian Empire. They were the biggest kid on the block at the time. And the reason that they were taken off into captivity was because of their long-standing and ongoing disobedience towards God and his commands for them. As you would remember, Israel was set up as God's covenant people. And one of the things that he expected from them was ongoing loyalty, obedience, and faithfulness to him as their God. Unfortunately, the tragedy of Israel's history is that for the large portion of their time in the land of Israel, they are disobedient, they are unfaithful, they engage in injustice, and more poignantly, engage in the worship of foreign gods. So rather than being faithful to their calling and their identity as being God's special people in the world, they decide to forsake that identity and worship the gods of the nations around them. As a result, God ends up following through with the curses that he enunciated in his covenant, that if they persisted in being disobedient, he would curse them and they would be invaded, they would be dominated by a foreign power and ultimately taken off into exile. And at the close of the Old Testament, we see two exiles take place. Firstly, the northern kingdom of Israel is taken off into captivity at the hands of the Assyrians. And then later on, in the 8th century BC, the southern kingdom of Judah is taken off into captivity at the hands of the Babylonians. And several tens of thousands of them are taken off and resettled in the heart of the Babylonian Empire. And this is where our New Testament story really gets started, because significant things happen in Israel as a people whilst they are in captivity. And let's explore for a moment the kind of things that we're talking about there. If you think about Israel in their land, it becomes really easy to tell who a Jew is. The Jews are those people who live in that land. So their identity is very much anchored and rooted in their geography, where they are located. They're in the land that God has given them. But when you pick them up and take them to a foreign land, questions of identity and worship now force some significant changes upon them as a people. Because even though they were unfaithful to God, now that they've moved into a foreign land, they have to work out, how are we going to retain our identity? Like any migrant group even today, when they move into a new land and live amongst a new people, the question of how do we retain our sense of who we are becomes particularly important. And one of the focal points of Israel's life back in Israel was their worship in the temple, corrupted as it had become. So one of the things we notice while they're in captivity is that the focal point of Jewish worship moves from the temple, because they no longer have one and they no longer have access to it. It moves from the temple worship to the development of something known as the synagogue. And we're obviously going to see lots of synagogues in the New Testament. What goes on with the arising of synagogue worship is that the focus of Jewish worship moves from the sacrificial system, which is what was the center of their temple worship, moves from that to the study of, the interpretation of, the teaching of, and the keeping of the law. Because this parallels one of the other really interesting things that has happened in the life of Israel at this time. They realized that they were taken off into captivity because of their disobedience. And now they're paying the price for that by being uprooted from their land and taken to a foreign one. So whilst they're there, as they're thinking through their own story and their own history and interpreting why is this happening to us, they realize that disobedience is one of their major downfalls. Consequently, they decide that they need to gather again around the law of God. So the synagogue system arises as a replacement of temple worship, but it also becomes a focal point for the study of the law so that Israel can basically re-establish themselves as God's people. So in exile, we find that the Jews around Babylon build places of worship, synagogues. All right, so we just talked about the development of the synagogue system. But there is another dimension to Israel's development of their religion whilst they are in captivity. Because the synagogue system is where they go to worship, but they spend most of their time out of the synagogue. So how do they differentiate themselves from their pagan neighbours? And this is where they started focusing on certain aspects of the law that they would keep faithfully so as to stand out from their pagan neighbours. And there are three things in particular that they focused on. Firstly, the food laws, because the Jewish food laws were things that pagans didn't understand and thought were strange. Secondly, with Sabbath keeping, because Jews were the only people who took a day off a week. And thirdly, was circumcision, a practice which pagans thought was totally abhorrent. And those three things were things that the Jews living amongst the pagans emphasised as being the things that sort of form the boundary markers between themselves as God's people and the unclean Gentile world. So those are some of the developments that is going on in Jewish life whilst they're in exile. Whilst they're there, by the way, the Babylonian Empire ends up being overthrown by the Persian Empire. And this is, if you're familiar with your Old Testament, you would have heard of people like Cyrus the Great. Cyrus is the king of the Persians, and he has a much more generous approach towards his subject peoples. As a result of his change of policy towards Israel, he allows Israel to return back to their land. And near the end of the Old Testament, we discover Israel returning from exile. So what we discover is that there are three different exiles during the 6th and into the early 5th century BC. There is a return under Zerubbabel in 537 BC. The temple gets restored in 516 BC. There is another return under Ezra the scribe in 458. And then there's another return under Nehemiah in 445 BC. So we have Israel returned to their land. So everyone's good with that, right? It's just business as usual, yeah? Because we're now back in their land. Unfortunately, it's not quite like that at all. The main reason for that is because even though Israel is allowed back into their land, they are still a subject people. They are allowed to return to their land, and they're even assisted back into their land through the support of Cyrus, the Persian king. And they're only going to be allowed to remain there as long as Cyrus continues to be generous towards them. So that means that whereas in the past they had a direct line towards God, they thought of themselves as a theocracy, that God was ultimately their king, and then that was represented in their own king, they now no longer have a Jewish king, they have a Persian king. And it's his ongoing generosity that allows them to remain in their land. So you can imagine that the Jews came back to their land full of expectation. But when they got there, their expectations found that reality was rather different. Here are a few things that they would have expected as they came back into their land, and you can start to see where their expectations and reality is different. First thing that they would have expected was that there would have been a full restoration of their nation. Because if we're allowed back into our land, it's because God has blessed us, God has favoured us, surely God is with us. We're just going to get back on track with all of God's promises. And God's promises for us was that Israel was going to be the chief of nations. So they're expecting the full restoration of their nation with independence, prosperity, security, their own identity, everything that comes with that package. A second thing that they were expecting was that Israel would return to the glory days of David and Solomon. If you were a Jew and you look back into your history and you thought, where were we the most right with God and what did that look like at the time, you would have picked the reigns of David and Solomon. We're independent, we're powerful, we're growing, we're rich, we're successful. All the nations are looking to us for example and wisdom. They're expecting that that is what it's going to be like when they're back in their land. Thirdly, as I've already mentioned, they're expected that Israel is going to be chief of nations. That's not just the most powerful or the most prominent. It actually meant rulership. They were expecting that Israel was going to become ruler of the nations. In fact, some people have perhaps jokingly suggested that the Jews of this time had a plan for global domination. They expected that God would elevate them to be the ruler over the Gentile peoples. And fourthly, and perhaps most significantly, the thing that they were looking for more than anything else was the return of God's glory to his temple. Because if you remember in the Old Testament, the temple was where the presence of God dwelt. And it was because God dwelt in the midst of Israel, that is what gave them their identity as God's people. One of the tragedies of the Old Testament was that because of their ongoing disobedience, the presence of God, the glory of God, departed from the temple. That was the sign of God's abandonment. But now that we're back in the land, now that we've rebuilt the temple, now that we've decided to be faithful and loyal to God again, the true sign that we are back on track with God's plans and purposes for us is that his presence and his glory would return to the temple. The question remains then, how many of those things were achieved by the return from exile? All right, let's explore, though, another dimension to the way that Israel's return from exile becomes even more challenging for them. Let's draw ourselves a picture. Israel, like any ancient society, is arranged a bit like a pyramid. And what that means is that at the top of the social pyramid, you've got the wealthy, you've got the powerful. Let's call them the aristocracy. And then you've got the rest of the population who live in greater or lesser degrees of poverty. The aristocracy own all the land, they provide all of the wealth, or they have all of the wealth. But the rest of the population lives on, in many cases, rented land, providing the wealth to the aristocracy through their agricultural produce. So now we've got this new setup for Israel where they are back in their land, but they are ruled by a Persian king. And their ability to remain in the land is determined by the ongoing generosity of that Persian king. What we discover goes on in ancient Israel is this social division ends up becoming politically and religiously oriented, in that the aristocracy realizes that in order to maintain and further their power, their influence and their wealth, their loyalty is going to be directed towards this Persian, this foreign king. However, the rest of the population, they stand to gain very little from the king's generosity because all of it is monopolised by the aristocracy. So the population, their focus is on being loyal to the Lord. And what we discover is that the aristocracy start changing in the character of their subculture to become more and more like their Gentile overlords. Whereas the rest of the population, they are becoming more and more focused on the law, more and more focused on purity, and discovering that there is actually a division within their society between their own sort of influential and dominant families and the rest of the population oriented along those kind of political lines. And that becomes a source of ongoing tension within Israel. It's bad enough that you're ruled by a foreign king, but now you've got within the people themselves this division between the ruling aristocracy, whose allegiance moves towards a foreign ruler, and the rest of the population, whose allegiance is now devoted more and more to the Lord. So this situation that we've got going on over here characterises the lay of the land when Israel comes back from exile. So it's a zone of some unfulfilled expectation in terms of what they thought was going to happen when they returned, but also this division within their society. That's bad enough, if you will. But things become a little bit more interesting as history unfolds. And a key figure is about to come onto the scene. His name is Alexander the Great. Many of you are probably familiar with him. Alexander lived from 356 to 323 BC. Now, Alexander, importantly, is a Greek. And if some of you have studied your ancient history, you would know about the significance and the sophistication of ancient Greek society. Alexander's father was King Philip of Macedon. Interestingly, he's the Philip after which the New Testament city of Philippi is named. Philip decided to give his son a tremendous Greek education. Many of you will have heard of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Well, Aristotle was contracted by Philip of Macedon to be Alexander's personal tutor. So you can understand then that Alexander got the premier Greek education, and he would have had instilled in him the values, the priorities, the way of looking at the world enshrined in Greek culture, including their philosophy, their religion, their arts, their literature, their ways of governing, their political philosophy, and their agenda to be Greeks in the larger world. Alexander became king of Macedonia after his father, King Philip, was murdered. And one of the first things that he did as the new king of Macedonia, after uniting the Greek city-states under his new kingship, is that he led the Greek army on an invasion of the Persian Empire. And what you can see from the map that's actually on your screens at the moment is that Alexander led an incredibly successful journey of conquest throughout the Persian Empire. As you can see, the Persian Empire was pretty vast, but Alexander, in the space of about 10 years, totally conquered the entire Persian Empire and was not defeated once in battle. He was an extraordinarily successful military commander. So Alexander, around the time that we are talking about, becomes the new ruler over what had previously been the Persian Empire. That means now, of course, that Israel, the land that the Jews have returned to, moves from being a Persian territory to now becoming a Greek territory. So there's a change of overlord. One overlord is as good as the next, you would think. This is, as I said, is where the story gets interesting. Because Alexander, quite understandably, believed in the superiority of Greek civilization. In order to make his rule over his very large empire much more smooth, one of his chief objectives was to Hellenize or to Greekify his new empire. So what that meant is that throughout his new empire, he imported and embedded all of the key features of Greek society and culture in his new empire. One of the key things that he changed was he introduced Greek as the language of the empire. As you can imagine, an empire as vast as the Persian had people who spoke all sorts of different languages, and that would make governing that vast empire rather difficult. So what Alexander decided to do was that he would firstly simplify the Greek language from its rather sophisticated classical form into a more simpler version, which is known as Koine Greek. And then he taught Koine Greek to his now multinational army and also made it the language of government throughout his empire. As a result of this, over a period of generations, what we see is that the entire region ends up speaking one language, which is the first time that has ever happened in human history up to that point. That also, by the way, is the reason why your New Testament is originally written in Koine Greek. So one of the things that Alexander does is that he makes Greek the language of his empire. A second thing that he does is he builds Greek cities throughout his new empire as he is conquering it. Many of you, for example, would be familiar with the city of Alexandria in northern Egypt. This is one of those Greek colonies that Alexander established through his journey of conquest that would become an outpost of Greek society and culture in that part of the world. It would also be garrisoned by Greek soldiers to enforce his rule. And so spread around Alexander's empire are a number of Alexandrias, which become outposts and beacons and enforcers of Greek civilization and culture in that region. So what we discover then, because Israel is now part of this Greek empire and Alexander has a program of Hellenization, that Greek culture now starts making a move into Israel. And that is where this diagram becomes important, because the ruling aristocracy here in Israel, as we've already highlighted, their tendency is now to start to lean towards the foreign king. When Cyrus was the king, that was relatively non-threatening. But now under Alexander and his program of Hellenization, the aristocracy of Israel now starts to Hellenize or Greekify, because they realise it's in their interest to cozy up to or to be in good relationships with their pagan ruler. It's good for business, it's good for trade, it's good so that your children have greater opportunities within the larger Greek establishment. So if you can gradually become more and more Greek, speak their language, become familiar with their philosophy, familiar with their culture, familiar with their way of doing government and business, that gives you greater opportunity. So what you'll find then is this aristocracy is becoming more and more Greek, which sharpens the division between them and the rest of the population, who is focusing on the law, who is wanting to remain pure and loyal to God. So things are now starting to become rather interesting in the life of Israel. Interestingly, as I've already alluded to, Alexander only lived for about 33 years. He died in 323 from some mysterious illness. It was possibly malaria. Now, Alexander, as you could imagine, expected to live and rule for a rather long period of time. So when he died at such a young age, he did not have a succession plan. He hadn't even got around to bearing any heirs. So when he died, what was going to happen to his empire? What ended up happening, and as you can see from the map on your screen, is that Alexander's empire ended up being divided amongst 4 of his key generals. And that division was not done peacefully. It was the result of civil war between those generals and their loyal troops. The 2 largest chunks of his empire got divided between 2 of his generals. The first one was the general named Ptolemy, and he took rulership over that part of Alexander's empire that was based in Egypt. And they ended up styling themselves as the inheritors of the pharaohs. The other major part of Alexander's kingdom was divided into the hands of his general named Seleucus, and he formed what came to be known as the Seleucid Empire, or also the Syrian Empire, and his empire was based in Antioch, which was in ancient Syria. So sometimes in the literature you'll hear these 2 empires now referred to as perhaps the Egyptian Empire or the Syrian Empire. The thing you need to realise, though, is that they are both fundamentally Greek empires, and they are continually committed to Alexander's agenda of Hellenizing their empires and making it Greek in nature, uniform in their language, and thus easy to rule and hopefully loyal to a central empire. So the period of time that we're talking about started off with 323 BC with the death of Alexander. Israel, for the first 100 or so years, is contained within the Ptolemies or the Egyptian Empire. And they are reasonably benevolent Hellenizers. One of the interesting things that happens during the reign of the Ptolemies for our story is the development of what is known as the Septuagint. As we've already alluded to, Greek became the standard language throughout the Greek empires. One of the results of that is the Jews, even those living in Israel, declined in their ability to speak Hebrew, and Greek became their standard language as well, or one of their standard languages. Consequently, in Israel and around the Greek Empire where the Jews were now living, they had lost the ability to read the Hebrew scriptures. Therefore, they needed a translation of those scriptures into the language that they all spoke, which was now Greek. The Septuagint was that translation. It was a translation of our Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, from Hebrew into ancient Greek. And that translation was done in Alexandria, supposedly at the hands of 70 or 72 different Jewish scholars. And the Septuagint, interestingly, becomes the standard version of the Jewish scriptures that the Jews around this region are reading all the way up to the time of Jesus and the time of Paul. An interesting result of that then is all of our quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament are actually quotations from the Septuagint, not quotations from the Hebrew scriptures themselves. Why is that important? Well, because what we discover is that the Septuagint in some places was a rather free translation. So if you've ever done the exercise of comparing an Old Testament quotation in the New Testament with with the equivalent passage in the Old, you'll discover that sometimes they are not precisely the same. The reason is because of the fluidity of that Greek translation of the Hebrew into Greek in the Septuagint. In 198 BC, a key event occurs. This is when the Seleucid Empire, which has been having ongoing conflict with the Ptolemaic Empire, succeeds in absorbing Israel into their empire. The reason that this is significant is because the Seleucids are much more aggressive Hellenizers than the Ptolemies. And in addition to that, they're also very aggressive adopters of an ancient practice that rulers going back as far as the pharaohs engaged in, which is to galvanize or unify their empire around the honoring and worship of the emperor, either as a god himself or perhaps as the key agent or representative of the gods. The Seleucid Empire engaging in this kind of emperor veneration or this emperor worship in an effort to unify, which is a very large and diverse empire, around the honouring and acknowledgement of the emperor as being an emperor by divine right, the one that the gods have installed. And therefore, you don't want to get the gods offside, so you worship the god, which is the emperor or his representative. This reaches a high point with the reign of the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And as you would know, an epiphany is a manifestation, and what he was in particularly wanting to refer to by nicknaming himself that is that he understood himself to be a manifestation of the gods. Antiochus IV clearly is, you could call him a megalomaniac. He certainly is very egotistical. And he is very aggressively trying to unify his empire around his own reign. Now, by and large, his empire is quite happy with that arrangement. They are happy with ongoing centralization and Hellenization of their empire, except for one troublesome region, which is Israel. As you would all recall, Israel, having come back from exile, the large portion of their population wants to be faithful to the Lord because they are hoping that God's plans and purposes for Israel are just going to increase and increase and increase, and that God is eventually going to set them free from their pagan rulers, that God is going to reestablish them as the chief of nations, God's glory is going to return to the temple. They are hoping for that to happen. Therefore, they are determined to be loyal to the Lord and to the keeping of his law. But now they've got a foreign king who is very aggressively wanting to Hellenize their region. Here are some of the things that Antiochus IV does. For example, he starts building institutions of Greek civilization within Jerusalem itself. One of those things, for example, was a gymnasium, which is not just a place where people go to do physical exercise. A gymnasium was a Greek school where they trained typically Greek men in all of the features and sophistication of Greek society to prepare them to take on their role as citizens within the Greek community. So a Greek gymnasium was built in Jerusalem right next to the temple. There's a fairly provocative act. One of the other things that becomes a feature of Antiochus IV's rulership is the way that the high priesthood becomes reconfigured. Many of you would remember that in ancient Israel, in the Old Testament, the high priest is at the pinnacle of the Jewish religious system. He controls the temple, he controls controls the worship of God through the sacrificial system, he is a position of quite significant religious power. But the only people who could take up that position were those who were descended from Aaron and as part of the tribe of the Levites. However, during the reign of the Seleucids, the high priesthood becomes a political position. And rather than only being available to those who were descended from the tribe of Levi, the high priesthood can now be bought for money to the highest bidder. And the high priest is appointed by who? By the king. In this case, a pagan Gentile king who has designs on himself as being the god. So now you see a rather interesting situation developing in Israel, which makes things even more problematic. The aristocracy realise that the high priesthood is the chief political position and start jockeying amongst themselves, offering greater and greater amounts of money to have one of their family appointed to be a high priest. Because when you're a high priest, that gives you even greater wealth, prominence, power and influence. So Antiochus IV significantly corrupts the high priesthood as away from being the centre of loyal worship of God, so that the whole temple system becomes corrupted. As you could well imagine, this creates rather significant issues for the Jews who are wanting to be loyal to God. By and large, what we discover that most of the population does is that they just double down on their determination to be faithful to the Lord by keeping his laws. And it's during this period in particular that we see groups like the Pharisees really come to prominence, because they make that their focus. It's also during this period where we see the increasing rise of what is known as messianic expectation, namely that God is going to raise up a deliverer for Israel who is going to set them free from their pagan rulers. They get this idea from their own Jewish scriptures, because you'd well imagine that if you were a Jew living through times of occupation and oppression and difficulty, one of the questions you're asking is, Lord, what is it that you're up to? What are you going to do for Israel to get us out of this mess? And the chief place that you're going to go to is your own scriptures. And it's when you go to your own scriptures, you come across passages like this in Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel has a vision of an individual who God is going to raise up to set his people free. Let's have a quick read of this in Daniel 7:13-14. It says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one who was like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." This Son of Man figure then is interpreted as the leader that God is going to raise up and give him a kingdom, give him political and military might to set Israel free and to ultimately then rule the world. Another example of these kind of scriptures is we can find in Isaiah chapter 61. This is a passage well known to us as Christians, but I'd like you to imagine how a Jew might have read this during this period. It starts off with, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendour. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations." In this passage, you can see God again raising up an anointed figure, and probably an anointed king, who was anointed powerfully to proclaim freedom and liberty and prosperity to Israel so that Israel can be set free and can get about the business of re-establishing themselves as God's chosen and favoured people. So in summary then, as Israel through reading of their scriptures starts to anticipate and look forward to a Messiah, an anointed one, a deliverer, what kind of things are they expecting that Messiah to be? The first thing they're expecting their Messiah to be is a king, and in particular, a king like David. They would remember the prophecies given to David that he would never lack for a descendant to sit on the throne. And they would remember David's reign as being a time when God delivered them from the Philistines, another pagan oppressing nation, just like they needed today to be delivered from the Greeks. A second thing that they would expect then, that this king would deliver them from pagan oppression. As a result of which they would cause the nation to now prosper religiously, economically, militarily, politically, to become the chief of nations. The Messiah would lead them into their destiny as God's people. And ultimately what they expected then is that the Messiah would return Israel to the glory days of Kings David and Solomon, when Israel was wealthy, prosperous, independent, and a light to the nations. You can understand that during this period, those kind of messianic expectations are going to become very prominent. It's during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes that things reach a crisis point. As we've already mentioned, the Seleucid and the Ptolemies are always fighting against each other. Even though they're both Greek, they hate each other and they're always trying to steal or to win territory from each other. And a key year in our story is 169 BC, where Antiochus, with the help of the high priest that he has installed, a Jewish aristocrat who was paid a significant amount of money for the privilege, decides that he's going to fight against the Ptolemaic Empire. So he gets his army and he marches his army through Israel. In order to fund his war against the Ptolemies, with the help of this high priest, he plunders the wealth of the temple and uses the wealth and riches of the temple to pay his soldiers and to fund his campaign. However, when he gets to the border with the Ptolemies down near Egypt, he's confronted by what turns out to be a rather significant individual. One of the backstories that has been going on during this period has been the rise of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire is gradually becoming more and more powerful in the Mediterranean region. And what is often the case around this time is that empires which perhaps not as powerful as they had hoped start looking to the Romans for backing or for support in their own conflicts. And this is what the Ptolemies do. They see that the Seleucids are on their way to invade, and they call to Rome for help. And out there in the desert of Sinai, when Antiochus is bringing his army to invade Egypt, he's confronted by a single Roman ambassador, Gaius Popilius. And he stands before Antiochus and says, think carefully about what you're about to do. If you decide to invade, you're not just going to have to be fighting the Ptolemies, you're going to be fighting Rome. And Rome, as I said, has become very powerful at this point. And the story goes that Gaius took his staff and drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus IV and said, by the time you step out of this circle, you are going to have made your decision. This is where we get the idea of drawing a line in the sand, by the way. Antiochus decides that he doesn't want to fight a war against the Ptolemies and the Romans. That's an unwinnable war. So he retreats with his tail between his legs back to Antioch. But on the way, he is so frustrated and annoyed by his humiliating backdown that when he arrives at Jerusalem, he decides to exert or wreak some vengeance upon these troublesome Jewish people. And there's a few things that he does whilst he is there in Jerusalem. He kills as many Jews as he's able to get his hands on. He destroys the city wall. He makes Jewish religious practices illegal. It becomes illegal to circumcise your son, illegal to teach your children the law. It's illegal to even own a copy of Torah, the Jewish law, and these are crimes punishable by death. The food laws are abolished, circumcision is forbidden, and interestingly, on December the 25th, in the year 167 BC, he erects a small altar to Zeus in the precincts of the Jewish temple and sacrifices a pig. These are exceptionally provocative actions, as you can imagine, which bring things within Israel who are trying to be loyal to God to a crisis point. What's going to happen next?